Dr. Marcus Johnson steps out of his Tesla, exhaustion weighing heavy on his shoulders after 14 hours in the operating room. The neighborhood is silent except for the gentle patter of rain against perfectly manicured lawns, his mind still racing with images of the complex emergency surgery he had just completed, saving a young girl's life from a devastating brain hemorrhage. The security lights of his Victorian-style home cast long shadows across the wet pavement as he searches for his house keys in his backpack, his blue surgical scrubs still bearing traces of blood from the intense procedure, his hands usually steady from years of precise surgical work, now trembling slightly from fatigue and the dropping temperature. Officers James Wilson and Michael Brooks sit in their patrol car observing the scene, their recent briefing about a series of high-end burglaries in the area making them particularly alert. Officer Wilson, a 20-year veteran of the force, nudges his partner as they watch Dar Johnson struggle with his keys, neither officer bothering to cross-reference the address with resident records that would have prevented the next 15 minutes from becoming national news. The officers approach silently, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. Dar Johnson remains unaware of their presence, his thoughts still with his patient in the ICU. His phone buzzes with updates from the nursing staff about her stable vital signs, the screen illuminating his face for a brief moment before Officer Brooks' commanding voice shatters the quiet street. Dr. Johnson turns slowly, raising his hands instinctively, the same hands that had just delicately navigated the complex pathways of a human brain. Officer Wilson immediately moves to restrain him, the cold metal of handcuffs contrasting sharply with the warmth of surgical gloves he had worn just an hour ago. Nearby, a security camera silently records every moment of the confrontation, its footage destined to be played and replayed in courtrooms and news broadcasts across the country. Despite Dar Johnson's calm attempts to explain his presence, showing his hospital ID badge and gesturing toward his house, the situation escalates quickly. Officer Brooks interprets his medical terminology as suspicious behavior, their body cams recording his patient professional responses as combative and uncooperative. The irony of their report would later become evident when compared to the actual footage. A neighbor peers through their window. Mrs. Patricia Martinez, a retired judge, recognizes Dar Johnson immediately, but her calls to the police dispatch are logged and inexplicably delayed. The officer's radio for backup, reporting a suspicious individual using medical terminology to avoid arrest, their description omitting Dar Johnson's repeated attempts to prove his identity and residence. The sound of additional sirens approaches as Dar Johnson stands handcuffed in his own driveway, the same driveway where he had hosted a neighborhood barbecue just last weekend, where Officer Wilson had declined an invitation, choosing to patrol instead. The growing pool of light from police vehicles illuminates the brass nameplate by the door reading Dr. Johnson, MD, Chief of Neurosurgery, neither officer bothering to verify this crucial detail. Inside, Dar Johnson's phone continues to buzz with updates about his patient, her parents unaware that the surgeon who saved their daughter's life is being pushed into the back of a police car, his requests to answer the medical updates falling on deaf ears. Officer Brooks dismisses the incoming hospital calls as potential accomplice communications, marking them as evidence in what he assumes is a burglary attempt in progress. The night shift dispatcher finally connects Mrs. Martinez's frantic calls, but the damage is already done. Dar Johnson watches his home fade from view in the rear window of the police cruiser, his mind racing between concern for his patient and disbelief at his situation. The security footage continues recording, capturing crucial moments that would later become key evidence, the camera's unblinking eye documenting every procedural violation, an ignored attempt at identification. At the precinct, booking officers process Dar Johnson with efficiency born of routine, his surgical ID badge and hospital credentials placed in an evidence bag. His protests about needing to check on his patient dismissed as attempted deception. The holding cell door closes with a final clang, while across town in the hospital his young patient begins to show signs of needing the expertise of the doctor now sitting behind bars. Officer Wilson and Brooks complete their report, congratulating themselves on preventing another burglary in the affluent neighborhood, unaware that their actions have just set in motion a series of events that would expose decades of systematic profiling, force a national conversation about police reform, and ultimately lead to one of the most dramatic courtroom revelations in recent history. The night shift ends, but the real story is just beginning. Attorney Sarah Chen strides through the precinct doors at 4 a.m., her heels echoing against the cold linoleum floor, her tablet displaying dozens of emergency messages from the hospital administration about their missing chief of neurosurgery. The night shift desk sergeant barely looks up as she demands to see her client, her reputation for taking on high-profile civil rights cases preceding her into the fluorescent-lit room. Behind the holding cell bars, Dar Johnson sits with his head in his hands, his surgical scrubs, now wrinkled and stained, a stark contrast to the pristine operating room he left just hours ago, his thoughts consumed by his young patient in recovery, while Chen's paralegal Marcus Rodriguez works frantically at their office, discovering a pattern that would shake the department to its core. Rodriguez's digital forensics revealed deleted records from 3 different police districts where officers Wilson and Brooks had been transferred following similar incidents. His computer screen fills with complaint files that were mysteriously closed without investigation, each case involving successful professionals of color stopped in affluent neighborhoods, the evidence forming a damning timeline of systematic profiling at the hospital. Dar Johnson's resident, Sarah Thompson, handles the postoperative care of their critical patient, her hands trembling as she makes crucial decisions without her mentor's guidance. The young girl's parents, growing increasingly anxious about their daughter's surgeon's unexplained absence. The hospital administrator paces in his office preparing statements for the media storm he knows will break with the morning news. Chen confronts the booking officer with hospital security footage showing Dar Johnson performing the emergency surgery just hours before his arrest. The officer shifts uncomfortably as she plays the video on her tablet, the precise movements of the surgeon's hands saving a life while across town his freedom was being taken away, the timestamp clearly visible in the corner of the screen becoming crucial evidence. In the evidence room, an overnight clerk catalogs Dar Johnson's belongings, discovering his hospital ID badge, hospital pager, and a blood-stained surgical cap from the emergency procedure. The clerk notes with growing unease that these items were marked as possible burglary tools in the initial report, their obvious medical nature contradicting the officer's narrative. Officer Wilson's partner, Officer Brooks, sits at his desk typing the arrest report, his language carefully chosen to justify their actions, but the precinct security cameras record him deleting and rewriting several sections as he struggles to maintain the narrative of a combative subject, the truth of their body cam footage weighing heavily on his conscience. Across town, Officer Wilson's daughter Emma, a 4th-year medical student who had once attended Dar Johnson's guest lecture on neurosurgery, receives a text about his arrest, her world crashing down as she realizes her father has detained the very doctor she had hoped would mentor her through her residency. Her fingers hover over her father's contact information, torn between family loyalty and professional ethics. Chen discovers a crucial detail in the officer's patrol pattern. That night they had deviated from their assigned route to specifically monitor Dar Johnson's street despite no reported suspicious activity in the area. Her legal pad fills with notes as she builds a case that would expose years of targeted surveillance. Dar Johnson watches the holding cell clock tick past 5 a.m. knowing his patient needs critical follow-up care. His repeated requests to make a medical call denied by officers who view his medical concerns as elaborate deception. The irony of his situation grows as emergency room staff desperately try to reach him for consultation on a new trauma case. Rodriguez uncovers body camera footage from 3 other incidents involving the same officers, each showing a pattern of escalating simple encounters with minorities into arrests. The footage automatically uploaded to cloud storage before it could be altered or deleted, becoming a digital trail of evidence that would soon unravel years of misconduct. In the Criminal Justice Center, Judge William Foster receives an urgent early morning call about the case, his own experience as Dar Johnson's patient giving him unique insight into the situation, his clerk already pulling records of similar profiling cases as dawn breaks over the city skyline. Chen prepares multiple motions, her legal strategy taking shape as she connects the officer's past conduct with the current incident, her phone buzzing with messages from civil rights organizations offering support and resources, the case already catching the attention of national media outlets before the sun has fully risen. Dar Johnson finally receives his phone call, choosing to contact the hospital instead of family, his dedication to patient care unwavering even in custody. The night nurse patches him through to his resident, their brief consultation ensuring his patient's continued recovery while providing another timestamp that would prove crucial in establishing the timeline of events. As morning approaches, the precinct grows busy with shift change. Officer Wilson arrives early, hoping to reinforce the narrative in their report, unaware that Chen has already gathered enough evidence to dismantle their carefully constructed justification. The next few hours would set the stage for a courtroom drama that would challenge not just their actions but the entire system that enabled them. The preliminary hearing room buzzes with tension as Judge William Foster enters, his eyes meeting Dar Johnson's for a brief moment, recognition flickering between them. 5 years earlier, the surgeon had spent 18 hours in delicate operation saving the judge's wife from a devastating brain aneurysm. Now they meet again under dramatically different circumstances, the weight of legal procedure hanging heavy in the air. Officer Wilson sits rigid in his chair next to the department's attorney, his daughter Emma, slipping quietly into the back row of the gallery, her medical textbooks clutched to her chest like a shield, her presence unknown to her father, as she watches her future collide with her past, her mentor in surgical rotation, now facing charges because of her father's actions. Attorney Chen rises her tablet, connecting wirelessly to the courtroom display system. Officer Brooks shifts uneasily as security footage from the hospital fills the screen, the timestamp showing Dar Johnson methodically performing complex surgery just 2 hours before his arrest, the quiet competence of his movements in the operating room contrasting sharply with the officer's description of a belligerent suspect. The gallery falls silent as Chen introduces the hospital's chief of surgery, who testifies about Dar Johnson's groundbreaking work in pediatric neurosurgery, his innovative techniques having saved countless lives, including several children of law enforcement officers. Sitting in that very courtroom, Officer Wilson stares at his hands as the chief mentions a particular case involving his own nephew last summer. Judge Foster leans forward with particular interest as Chen presents a timeline of events, her evidence meticulously documenting every moment from Dar Johnson's emergency call to surgery to his arrest. The prosecutor's attempts to justify the officer's actions growing weaker with each new piece of evidence, the truth unfolding like a carefully choreographed dance. Emma Wilson watches her father gradually sink deeper into his chair as hospital security footage shows him personally thanking Dar Johnson 6 months earlier after the successful surgery on his nephew. The same hands he had shaken in gratitude now bearing marks from the tight handcuffs his partner had applied, the irony not lost on the gathered spectators. Chen introduces a surprise witness, the hospital administrator, who explains the critical nature of Dar Johnson's role and the potentially devastating consequences of his unnecessary detention. 3 emergency cases had been diverted to other hospitals during his arrest, the ripple effects of that night's actions spreading far beyond a simple case of mistaken identity. Officer Brooks' legal representative attempts to maintain their narrative of suspicious behavior, but their arguments crumble as Chen plays enhanced audio from the body cameras, revealing conversations between the officers before approaching Dar Johnson, their words suggesting premeditation rather than reasonable suspicion, the judge's expression darkening with each revelation. In the midst of the proceedings, a commotion at the courtroom doors draws all eyes as Dar Johnson's current patient, a prominent senator's daughter, is wheeled in, still wearing hospital gear, her parents following close behind, their testimony about receiving his emergency call and watching him rush to save their daughter, adding another layer to the growing evidence of his character and dedication. Judge Foster calls a brief recess, his own memories of Dar Johnson's professional dedication mixing with his judicial duty. Officer Wilson uses this moment to glance back at the gallery, finally noticing his daughter, her presence hitting him like a physical blow. As she meets his eyes with a mixture of disappointment and sadness, her dreams of medical career suddenly complicated by her father's actions. When proceedings resume, Chen presents statistical evidence compiled by her paralegal showing a pattern of similar stops in affluent neighborhoods targeting minorities, the data painting a clear picture of systematic profiling. Officer Brooks maintains his defensive posture, but Officer Wilson begins to show visible signs of distress as the weight of their actions becomes increasingly apparent. The courtroom atmosphere grows heavier as Chen reveals security footage from Dar Johnson's neighborhood showing the officers deviating from their assigned patrol route multiple times in the weeks leading up to the arrest, their targeting of specific homes becoming obvious as the evidence mounts. Judge Foster takes detailed notes, his personal experience with Dar Johnson adding depth to his understanding of the case. Emma Wilson finally steps forward during a crucial moment, requesting to address the court, her dual perspective as a medical student and officer's daughter adding unprecedented dimension to the proceedings. Her testimony about Dar Johnson's influence on her medical education and her father's recent behavior, creating a complex narrative of personal and professional conflict. As the preliminary hearing draws to a close, Judge Foster looks down at Dar Johnson, seeing not just the defendant before him but the surgeon who gave his wife more years of life. Officer Wilson glances between his daughter and his former benefactor, the complexity of his choices evident in his expression, while Officer Brooks maintains his rigid stance even as their case continues to unravel. The hearing concludes with Chen requesting additional charges be considered against the department for systematic civil rights violations, the evidence presented laying groundwork for a case that would extend far beyond a single incident of profiling. Judge Foster schedules the next hearing. His personal connection to the case, adding another layer to an already complex legal drama that would soon capture national attention. District Attorney Tom Reynolds stands before the court, his confident demeanor masking growing uncertainty as he presents crime statistics from the Oakwood Heights neighborhood, attempting to justify the officer's heightened vigilance. The overhead screens display graphs and charts of recent burglaries, his carefully prepared narrative already beginning to fray at the edges. Attorney Chen sits calmly at the defense table, her tablet displaying a series of timestamps that would soon dismantle the prosecution's entire argument. Dar Johnson beside her reviews surgical notes from the night in question, his steady hands now documenting every detail of his emergency procedure, while Reynolds' voice echoes through the courtroom. The prosecution calls their expert witness, a veteran police trainer who attempts to explain proper procedure for suspicious persons. Stops. The gallery stirs as Chen rises for cross-examination, her first question about racial bias in police training, causing Reynolds to shift uncomfortably in his chair, the witness stumbling over statistics that contradict departmental claims. Judge Martinez from next door to Dar Johnson takes the stand, her testimony devastating to the prosecution's case, as she describes 3 years of watching her neighbor save lives at all hours, her security cameras having captured countless nights of him returning from emergency surgeries. Reynolds attempts to discredit her perspective, but her judicial experience makes her an unshakable witness. The courtroom screens spring to life with surveillance footage from the hospital parking garage showing Dar Johnson rushing in for the emergency surgery, his Tesla timestamp matching perfectly with the hospital's records. Reynolds objects to the evidence, but Chen produces certification of its authenticity, the timeline destroying any suggestion of suspicious behavior. Emma Wilson watches from the gallery as her father's partner, Officer Brooks, whispers urgently with Reynolds, their body language suggesting growing discord in the prosecution team. Her medical textbook open to a chapter on emergency neurosurgery, written by Dar Johnson himself, the irony of studying her father's arrest victim not lost on the aspiring doctor. Chen projects a series of emails between Officer Wilson and Brooks revealing discussions about monitoring specific neighborhoods, their communication showing a pattern of targeting that extended beyond standard patrol procedures. Reynolds attempts to explain away the correspondence, but the evidence speaks volumes in the silent courtroom. Dar Johnson's entire surgical team fills 2 rows of the gallery, their presence a testament to his character, as Chen calls them one by one to verify his movements. That night, the head nurse describes the emergency call, the surgical prep, the intense concentration during the procedure, her timeline matching hospital records perfectly, while Reynolds struggles to maintain his narrative. The prosecution attempts to pivot, focusing on the officer's reasonable suspicion standard. But Chen produces security footage from 3 other incidents involving the same officers, each showing similar stops of minorities in affluent areas. Reynolds' objections grow weaker as the pattern becomes impossible to ignore, Judge Foster taking detailed notes. Officer Wilson stares at his shoes as Chen plays enhanced audio from his body cam revealing conversations before approaching Dar Johnson, the discussion of target profiles and suspicious behavior, contradicting their written report. Reynolds stands to object, but the damage is already done, the truth echoing in the silence that follows. The hospital administrator takes the stand explaining the critical nature of Dar Johnson's position and the potentially catastrophic consequences of detaining an emergency surgeon. Reynolds questions the relevance, but Chen connects it directly to the officer's duty to investigate before escalating, showing how a simple check of Dar Johnson's credentials would have prevented the entire incident. Emma Wilson finally catches her father's eye across the courtroom, his face falling as he realizes she has witnessed every moment of the prosecution's failing defense, her presence forcing him to see the incident not just as an officer, but as a father whose daughter dreams of following in Dar Johnson's footsteps. Chen introduces evidence of Dar Johnson's national recognition in neurosurgery, his papers, his innovations, his saved lives flooding the screens, while Reynolds shuffles through his notes searching for a way to maintain the prosecution's stance. The contrast between the doctor's contributions and his treatment becoming stark in the minds of all present. The prosecution calls their final expert a crime analyst who attempts to justify the patrol pattern in Dar Johnson's neighborhood, but Chen methodically deconstructs their analysis, revealing biased data collection and ignored variables. Reynolds watches his case continue to unravel as the truth emerges piece by piece. Judge Foster leans forward with particular interest as Chen presents a detailed timeline of the officer's previous transfers between districts, each move following similar incidents of profiling. Reynolds objects to the scope of evidence, but the pattern proves relevant to establishing intent, the prosecution's justification of reasonable suspicion crumbling under the weight of historical context. As the day draws to a close, Reynolds stands for his closing argument, his earlier confidence replaced by visible strain as he attempts to salvage the prosecution's position, but the evidence mounted by Chen leaves little room for doubt. The truth of that night's events now clear to everyone in the courtroom, the next phase of the trial looming with potentially department-wide implications. Officer Michael Brooks takes the witness stand, his practiced composure betraying subtle cracks as he adjusts his collar beneath the courtroom's harsh lighting. Attorney Chen stands quietly reviewing notes on her tablet, while Dar Johnson watches intently, his surgical precision now focused on every detail of his accuser's testimony. The officer's account begins smoothly, reciting the night's events according to protocol, his voice steady as he describes responding to suspicious activity, but Chen remains patient, her years of civil rights cases teaching her the art of timing as she waits for the perfect moment to reveal her evidence, the gallery leaning forward in anticipation. Brooks describes their approach to Dar Johnson, painting a picture of confrontation and resistance, but his narrative stumbles as Chen activates the courtroom audio system, enhanced body cam footage, filling the space with crystal clear sound. His whispered, "Got another one," preceding their approach to Dar Johnson, the racial undertone impossible to ignore in the hushed courtroom. The prosecution attempts to object, citing audio enhancement protocols, but Chen produces certification from 3 independent audio labs, verifying the authenticity. Officer Wilson shifts uncomfortably in his seat as his partner's prejudice becomes undeniable, the weight of their shared actions visible in his slumped shoulders. Suddenly, the courtroom doors open, revealing an unexpected witness, Dar Johnson's current patient, Catherine Mitchell, the senator's daughter, being wheeled in, still wearing her hospital gown, her presence commanding attention as her father, the senator, follows close behind. Brooks' testimony, faltering at the sight of the young girl, whose life hung in the balance during their profiling incident. Chen methodically introduces hospital records showing Dar Johnson's emergency call about Catherine's condition, the timestamps aligning perfectly with the night of his arrest. Brooks attempts to maintain his narrative, but the evidence of Dar Johnson's life-saving work becomes increasingly difficult to dismiss as Catherine's father approaches the stand. Senator Mitchell describes receiving the emergency call about his daughter's condition, his voice breaking as he recounts Dar Johnson's immediate response and dedication. Brooks watches his case unravel as the senator details how the surgeon had rushed to the hospital only to be detained hours later while checking on his daughter's recovery. The enhanced body cam footage continues playing, showing Brooks dismissing Dar Johnson's attempts to explain his medical emergency. Chen zooms in on the footage, revealing the hospital ID clearly visible in Dar Johnson's hand, the officer's deliberate ignorance of evidence becoming apparent to everyone in the courtroom. Emma Wilson scribbles notes in her medical journal, her father's partner's testimony, forcing her to confront the reality of systemic bias in law enforcement, her dream of combining medicine with criminal justice reform taking shape as she watches the proceedings unfold. Brooks' voice growing defensive under Chen's methodical questioning. Chen introduces a series of text messages between Brooks and other officers, revealing a pattern of targeting specific neighborhoods and individuals, the evidence mounting as Brooks attempts to explain away his digital footprint, his previous confidence crumbling under the weight of his own documented words. Catherine Mitchell raises her hand, requesting to speak, her young voice cutting through the legal proceedings as she describes waking up after surgery to learn her doctor had been arrested, her testimony humanizing the impact of profiling as Brooks stares at his hands, unable to meet her steady gaze. The courtroom falls silent as Chen plays dispatch recordings from other incidents involving Brooks, revealing similar patterns of behavior, his attempts to justify each stop growing weaker as the evidence paints a clear picture of systematic profiling. Judge Foster taking detailed notes, his own experience with prejudice adding weight to his evaluation. Officer Wilson watches his partner struggling on the stand, their years of friendship and shared patrols now viewed through a new lens as Brooks' defensive responses reveal deeper biases, the truth of their actions becoming impossible to ignore in the face of overwhelming evidence. Chen presents documentation of civilian complaints against Brooks from 3 different districts, each showing similar patterns of targeting minorities in affluent areas, his transfers between departments now appearing as attempts to escape accountability rather than career advancement. The senator's security detail fills the back row of the courtroom, their presence adding tension as Brooks' testimony continues to deteriorate, his description of that night's events increasingly contradicted by video evidence, phone records, hospital documentation, and witness accounts. Catherine's mother takes the stand describing how Dar Johnson had explained the complex surgery to them, his compassion and expertise evident even in crisis. The contrast between his professional dedication and his treatment by law enforcement stark in the quiet courtroom. Brooks unable to reconcile his actions with the reality before him. As Brooks' testimony draws to a close, Chen delivers her final questions targeting the officer's training and biases, his responses growing increasingly defensive until he finally storms toward the courtroom exit. The judge's call for order drowned out by gasps from the gallery, his contempt charge adding another layer to the department's growing scandal. The day ends with Brooks' credibility in shambles, his testimony having revealed not just the events of one night but years of systematic profiling, the implications reaching far beyond a single incident as Judge Foster calls for a detailed review of all cases involving the officer, the truth of their actions now impossible to ignore or excuse. Dr. Elizabeth Morgan, Chief of Staff at Metropolitan General Hospital, approaches the witness stand, her pristine white coat and commanding presence drawing all eyes in the courtroom. She adjusts her glasses before beginning her testimony about Dar Johnson's revolutionary contributions to neurosurgery, her voice carrying the weight of decades of medical experience. Attorney Chen displays a series of medical journals on the courtroom screens highlighting Dar Johnson's breakthrough surgical technique that had revolutionized pediatric brain surgery. The gallery watches in stunned silence as video demonstrations show the innovative procedure that had saved hundreds of lives, including Officer Wilson's young nephew Tyler just 6 months earlier. The Chief of Staff describes the night of Tyler Wilson's emergency surgery, how Dar Johnson had rushed in at midnight after a family dinner, canceling his vacation to perform the delicate procedure. Officer Wilson sinks lower in his chair as security footage shows him embracing Dar Johnson in the hospital corridor, thanking him through tears for saving his sister's only child. Emma Wilson clutches her father's old thank you card to Dar Johnson found in his desk drawer that morning, her hands trembling as Dar Morgan describes how her cousin Tyler would have died without the surgeon's intervention, the reality of her father's actions becoming unbearable as she realizes he had arrested the man who gave her family hope. Shen introduces hospital records showing Dar Johnson's success rate with high-risk procedures, his dedication to treating patients regardless of their ability to pay, his weekly free clinic for underprivileged children. Officer Brooks stares blankly ahead as evidence of Dar Johnson's character contradicts every assumption made that fateful night. Dr. Morgan reveals that Dar Johnson had developed a training program for emergency responders, teaching them crucial procedures for handling brain trauma victims at accident scenes. Several officers in the gallery shift, uncomfortably recognizing themselves in the training footage now playing on the courtroom screens, their own lives touched by his work. The prosecution attempts to redirect focus to the night of the arrest, but Dar Morgan produces staffing schedules showing Dar Johnson's 70-hour work weeks, his dedication to patient care evident in the countless emergency surgeries performed at all hours, the contrast between his service and his treatment by law enforcement becoming impossible to ignore. Security footage from the hospital parking garage shows Dar Johnson rushing in for emergency cases time after time, his Tesla becoming a familiar sight in the emergency bay at all hours. Shen plays footage from the night of his arrest, the same dedication visible as he hurried to save another life only to be detained hours later. Officer Wilson finally looks up as Dar Morgan describes the day he personally thanked Dr. Johnson, organizing a small ceremony in the pediatric ward to honor the surgeon who saved his nephew. The memory of that day now tainted by his own actions, his partner Brooks refusing to meet his eyes as the truth of their misconduct becomes undeniable. The Chief of Staff presents statistics showing the impact of Dar Johnson's absence during his detention, 3 critical cases diverted to hospitals hours away, the ripple effects of that night's profiling touching countless lives. Judge Foster listens intently, his own wife's successful surgery a testament to the doctor's skill and dedication. Emma Wilson approaches the bench requesting permission to speak, her voice steady as she describes Dar Johnson's influence on her medical education, his guest lectures inspiring her to pursue neurosurgery, her father's actions now threatening to destroy the very relationship that could shape her future career. Dar Morgan produces letters from grateful families spanning Dar Johnson's career, each one telling a story of hope, restored lives, saved families made whole. Officer Wilson wipes his eyes as a letter from his own sister is read describing the miracle of Tyler's recovery, the courtroom silent as the weight of testimony settles. Shen displays hospital security footage showing Dar Johnson working late into the night, researching new techniques, teaching residents, performing surgery, his dedication to healing evident in every frame, the officer's actions that night now appearing increasingly inexcusable in light of the doctor's character and contributions. The prosecution attempts to maintain their narrative. Dar Morgan stands firm, describing the rigorous background checks required for hospital privileges, the multiple forms of identification Dar Johnson carries at all times, the absurdity of assuming he was an intruder in his own neighborhood becoming clear to everyone present. As her testimony concludes, Dar Morgan looks directly at Officers Wilson and Brooks, her final words reminding them that Dar Johnson remains on call for emergencies, even now, his commitment to saving lives unchanged by their actions, the gravity of their mistake evident in the faces of everyone in the courtroom. Special Agent Marcus Rodriguez from the Justice Department's Civil Rights Division stands before the court, his presence adding federal weight to the proceedings as he presents findings from a 6-month investigation into police practices across 3 districts where Officers Wilson and Brooks had served, his evidence revealing a disturbing pattern that extended far beyond a single incident. The elderly gardener, Thomas Martinez, approaches the stand, his weathered hands gripping the railing as he describes 30 years of maintaining properties in affluent neighborhoods, his testimony revealing how officers had systematically pressured maintenance workers to report suspicious persons while ignoring disturbances involving white residents, the truth of long-standing practices finally coming to light. Chen projects a series of internal affairs documents onto the courtroom screens showing complaint patterns that had been buried or dismissed. Officer Brooks' jaw tightens as years of hidden incidents emerge into public view, the statistical analysis revealing undeniable racial disparities in stop searches and arrests across all 3 districts. Special Agent Rodriguez introduces body camera footage from dozens of similar incidents, each showing the same pattern of behavior, the same selective enforcement, the same targeted profiling. Emma Wilson takes rapid notes, her research project on medical bias in criminal justice gaining unexpected first-hand evidence as the federal investigation unfolds. Thomas Martinez describes specific instances of being instructed to report people of color in the neighborhood, his voice steady as he recounts conversations with Officers Wilson and Brooks about maintaining the right kind of community. Chen entering each incident into evidence as the larger conspiracy becomes clear to the stunned courtroom. The Justice Department presents analysis of patrol patterns revealing systematic deviation from assigned routes to target specific neighborhoods. Officer Wilson stares at his badge as data shows increased surveillance of minority homeowners in affluent areas, the truth of their actions laid bare in charts, graphs, and testimonials. Dar Johnson watches intently as Special Agent Rodriguez reveals how similar incidents have been handled in other jurisdictions, the pattern of profiling extending beyond individual officers to suggest departmental culture. Judge Foster takes detailed notes, his own experience with bias adding depth to his understanding of the systemic issues. Shen introduces testimony from other maintenance workers, each describing similar instructions from law enforcement, their combined statements painting a picture of orchestrated surveillance and targeted enforcement. Officer Brooks shifts uncomfortably as former colleagues' testimonies corroborate the widespread nature of these practices. Emma Wilson listens as the investigation reveals coordination between officers in different districts, their communications showing awareness of each other's methods, and targets her father's involvement in a larger system becoming undeniable as evidence mounts, her medical ethics textbook forgotten in her lap as Justice Department findings continue. Special Agent Rodriguez presents internal communications showing how complaint investigations have been deliberately stalled or buried. Officer Brooks' previous transfers now appearing as strategic moves to avoid accountability, the prosecution's attempts to dismiss the evidence growing weaker with each new revelation. Thomas Martinez identifies specific officers who had pressured maintenance workers, his detailed records kept over decades providing crucial evidence of systematic profiling. Shen methodically connecting each incident to department policies and practices, the scope of the investigation expanding beyond individual actions. The Justice Department analysis reveals how official records have been manipulated to hide patterns of bias. Officer Wilson's expression changes as he realizes the full extent of the system he had participated in, his daughter's presence in the gallery, a constant reminder of the impact of these revelations on future generations. Chen displays heat maps showing concentration of stops and searches the visual evidence, clearly demonstrating targeting of minority residents in affluent areas. Special Agent Rodriguez explaining how this pattern repeated across multiple jurisdictions, the implications reaching far beyond a single department or incident. Emma Wilson watches as her father's career unravels in the wake of federal findings, her own future in medicine now intertwined with questions of systemic bias and institutional reform, her notes filling pages as she documents the intersection of law enforcement and racial profiling, her perspective forever changed by the proceedings. Thomas Martinez concludes his testimony with records of specific dates and times when officers had instructed him to monitor certain homes. His meticulous documentation, providing ironclad evidence of coordinated profiling, Chen entering each instance into the record as the full scope of departmental practices becomes clear. Special Agent Rodriguez presents findings showing how similar patterns have been identified in neighboring jurisdictions, the investigation revealing a broader culture of bias. Officer Brooks maintains his defensive posture, even as evidence of coordinated misconduct becomes impossible to ignore or excuse. The day concludes with the Justice Department announcing expansion of their investigation to additional districts. The implications of Dar Johnson's case extending far beyond a single night as systemic issues come to light. Judge Foster calls for a comprehensive review of departmental practices, the truth of long-standing bias finally facing public scrutiny. Silence falls over the courtroom as Officer James Wilson rises unexpectedly, requesting permission to address the court, his voice trembling with emotion as Judge Foster grants his request. Officer Brooks watches in disbelief as his partner of 8 years steps forward, removing his badge and placing it on the evidence table. Wilson begins speaking, his words coming slowly at first, then gaining momentum as he describes his journey in law enforcement, his initial idealism, his gradual acceptance of institutional biases, his role in perpetuating a system he now recognizes as fundamentally flawed. Emma watches from the gallery, tears streaming down her face as her father publicly confronts his own prejudices. Memories of Dar Johnson saving his nephew Tyler Flood. Wilson's testimony, his voice breaking as he recalls the surgeon's dedication, the endless hours of careful monitoring, the hope restored to his family, the sane man he had handcuffed and humiliated now sitting dignified at the defense table, his commitment to healing unchanged by the officer's actions. Officer Brooks interrupts, attempting to silence his partner, but Wilson continues, describing their unwritten protocols, their targeting of specific neighborhoods, their conscious choice to ignore identification and explanation, his confession laying bare years of systematic profiling. Judge Foster leans forward intently as the truth emerges unfiltered. Emma approaches the bench, requesting to stand beside her father, her presence giving him strength as he details specific incidents, patterns of behavior, casual prejudices that had become standard procedure. Officer Brooks' face darkens with each revelation, his own culpability becoming impossible to deny as his partner continues to speak. Wilson describes the night of Dar Johnson's arrest, his voice heavy with regret as he admits to dismissing clear evidence of the doctor's identity, ignoring his medical credentials, disregarding his legitimate reasons for being at his own home, the weight of these choices visible in his slumped shoulders as he faces the consequences of his actions. Officer Brooks suddenly stands, shouting objections, his composure finally cracking as Wilson reveals their predetermined targeting of certain residents. Chen watches quietly as the partnership dissolves in front of the court, years of shared bias and protected secrets unraveling in a moment of truth. The gallery murmurs as Wilson describes his awakening, how watching his daughter study medicine under Dar Johnson had forced him to confront his own prejudices, how the surgeon's dedication to healing had transcended racial barriers, how his own actions had threatened to destroy the very relationships that could shape his daughter's future. Brooks interrupts again, this time challenging Wilson's authority to speak for the department, but Judge Foster silences him as Wilson continues describing departmental cultures that encouraged profiling practices that rewarded targeting specific communities, policies that protected officers who maintained the status quo. Emma shares her own perspective, describing how her father's actions had impacted her medical studies, her understanding of systemic bias, her commitment to combining medicine with justice reform. Officer Brooks attempts to discredit her testimony, but her words carry weight as both daughter and medical student. Wilson turns to Dar Johnson directly, his voice thick with emotion as he apologizes not just for one night but for years of prejudice, for countless stops and searches for a system he helped maintain. Dar Johnson meets his gaze steadily, his capacity for forgiveness evident in his quiet dignity. Officer Brooks storms toward the exit, ignoring the judge's orders to remain, his contempt charge echoing through the courtroom as bailiffs move to intercept his departure, marking the final breakdown of partnership and protection that had sheltered years of misconduct. Wilson continues his testimony, now focused on solutions, describing necessary changes in training, recruitment, oversight, his experience providing valuable insight into reforming a broken system. Emma stands proudly beside him as he commits to being part of positive change rather than continuing patterns of prejudice. Judge Foster questions Wilson directly about specific incidents, policies, procedures, the officer answering with newfound honesty as years of protected practices are exposed, Chen taking careful notes as new evidence emerges from this unexpected source. The courtroom watches in silence as Wilson removes his service weapon, placing it beside his badge, his career of 20 years ending by choice, rather than force, his dedication to truth and reform replacing his loyalty to a flawed system, his daughter wrapping her arms around him in support. Dar Johnson rises, approaching Wilson with extended hand, the gesture of forgiveness powerful in its simplicity. Officer Brooks watches from custody in the hallway as his former partner accepts responsibility for their shared actions, the contrast in their responses marking different paths forward. Wilson concludes his testimony by presenting his own records of problematic incidents, his documentation providing crucial evidence for departmental reform. Judge Foster acknowledges his courage in coming forward while noting the serious consequences that must follow such long-standing misconduct. Judge Foster rises to deliver the verdict, his chambers having witnessed countless cases, but none quite like this one. The morning sunlight streams through courthouse windows as he begins addressing the profound implications of racial bias in law enforcement, his voice carrying the weight of both judicial authority and personal experience. All charges against Dar Johnson are dismissed with prejudice, the judge's words echoing through the silent courtroom as he orders a comprehensive review of departmental procedures, his decision extending far beyond a single incident to address systemic issues. Officer Wilson stands quietly, his daughter Emma beside him as the judge outlines mandatory reforms. The ruling requires the creation of a groundbreaking community policing program. Dar Johnson and former Officer Wilson appointed as co-chairs, their unlikely partnership symbolizing the possibility of transformation and healing. Emma watches proudly as her father and mentor unite to reshape law enforcement training, their shared vision focusing on understanding and empathy. Officer Brooks' resignation letter becomes public, revealing a deeper network of coordinated profiling across multiple districts. Federal investigators step in, expanding their probe to neighboring departments, the implications reaching far beyond local jurisdiction as patterns of systematic bias emerge into public view. Dar Johnson returns to his operating room, his skilled hands continuing to save lives, while also leading workshops for law enforcement officers, teaching them to see beyond prejudice, to recognize humanity in every encounter, his surgical precision now applied to healing societal wounds as well as physical ones. Wilson transitions from officer to reformer, his experience providing valuable insight into changing police culture. Emma works alongside him, developing medical response protocols for law enforcement, her dual perspective as doctor's daughter and officer's daughter bridging gaps between emergency services and community needs. The police academy curriculum undergoes complete revision, incorporating lessons learned from the case scenario training, now includes implicit bias awareness, medical emergency response, and community engagement. Dar Johnson regularly speaks to new recruits, sharing his story as both victim and catalyst for change. Brooks faces federal charges, his testimony revealing years of coordinated profiling efforts. Other officers come forward, their confessions painting a picture of institutional bias that had gone unchecked for decades, the truth finally emerging as protective silence gives way to accountability. Dar Johnson's foundation establishes scholarships for minority students pursuing medical careers, the program specifically supporting those interested in emergency medicine and trauma surgery. Emma becomes the first recipient, her commitment to combining healthcare with criminal justice reform inspiring a new generation. Wilson joins the foundation's board, his understanding of law enforcement helping bridge divides between police and medical services. His daughter's graduation from medical school becomes a symbol of transformation as she accepts her white coat from Dar Johnson, their story inspiring others to challenge systemic bias. The community policing program expands to neighboring cities, its success drawing national attention as crime rates drop while community trust grows. Dar Johnson and Wilson travel together, sharing their experience, their unlikely friendship demonstrating the power of understanding and redemption. Hospital emergency protocols are revised, incorporating lessons from the case. Police officers now receive specialized training in recognizing medical professionals and emergency responders, the changes preventing similar incidents while improving coordination between emergency services. Emma completes her residency under Dar Johnson's guidance, her research on medical bias in criminal justice becoming required reading in both police academies and medical schools, her father's story intertwined with her mentors, creating powerful testimony to the possibility of change. The Justice Department investigation leads to departmental oversight reforms spreading across the country. Other jurisdictions adopt similar programs combining medical awareness with law enforcement training, Dar Johnson's case becoming a catalyst for nationwide policy changes. Rooks serves his sentence while Wilson works to reform the system, their divergent paths highlighting individual choice in perpetuating or challenging institutional bias, their story becoming a case study in police academy ethics training. Dar Johnson performs another life-saving surgery on Officer Wilson's son, the operation symbolizing healing beyond the physical as 3 generations gather in the waiting room, their shared experience touching lives far beyond the operating theater. The Foundation's influence grows, establishing training centers nationwide where medical professionals and law enforcement officers learn to work together. Emma leads research initiatives studying the impact of bias on emergency response, her findings shaping future policies. Judge Foster presents the case at judicial conferences, his experience adding weight to discussions of systemic reform. Other jurisdictions adopt similar oversight measures, the ripples of change spreading through the justice system. A year after the verdict, Dar Johnson stands before a new class of police cadets, his story now part of their training. Wilson joins him at the podium, their shared commitment to transformation evident as they guide the next generation toward a more just future.